Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today we're going to be discussing a relationship that's both celebrated and strained, India and the United States. Despite talk of being natural allies, sharing democratic values, recent events have really tested the foundations of this partnership, from the sudden spike in visa fees to mass deportation of Indian nationals earlier this year, and to US's posture after Operation Sindoor, India is increasingly being forced to ask, how reliable is Washington really? At the same time, the Quad's future hangs in the balance. There's no confirmation on the next summit. Japan's leadership is in a limbo, and Trump has clearly reignited concerns about the credibility of multilateral frameworks in the Indo Pacific. To discuss this and more, today I have with me Rushali Saha. Rushali is an independent researcher and foreign affairs columnist. She's currently a Maitri Fellow at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center and also a Pakistan fellow at the Takshashila Institution. Rushali, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me again, Vanshika. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So we'll get right in. Firstly, since we're discussing India US ties, can you give us a preview of how our relations have reached this low point? I mean, in the first two terms, both the leaders seem to share quite a bonhomie. Modi went to Texas, Trump came to India. So clearly something has changed. So, what are the differences that you see between Trump's first term versus the current one? And what really has led to this tension between the two countries?
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Vanshika. I think at the very outset, it's very important not to assume any sort of continuity between Trump's first and second terms. Okay. He's evolved significantly as a political actor. And, considering that President Trump today is different from what he was yesterday, reverting back to 2017 is quite unhelpful and I would say even counterproductive. And in my sense, New Delhi's strategy for managing a second Trump presidency, in fact, relied very heavily on the dynamics of his first term. And it's clear now that that is extremely outdated. So, in his current iteration, Trump is definitely more self assured. He's more decisive and he's less inclined to defer to expert advice or diplomatic nuance. And coming to how we've reached this low point, I think it was with Trump's public claim of offering mediation in the India Pakistan dispute, which, of course, is a direct contradiction of India's long-standing position that the issue is strictly bilateral. What this also did was it sort of reintroduced the idea of hyphenating India and Pakistan, which reverses the dehyphenation approach, which was initiated during the Bush era and has continued through successive administrations and was arrived at quite painstakingly, if I may add, as well. And that has been central to India US alignment. So President Trump coming in and claiming credit for having mediated the crisis, that did not go down well in New Delhi. And of course, New Delhi came out and publicly opposed this as well. So there's clearly two different messages coming from the India and US. And I think that is where it started. And that is where things started getting sour. And it stalled the momentum also on the potential trade deal, which until then both sides had been quite optimistic about, right? And shortly afterwards, of course, we saw the imposition of tariffs, which further compounded tensions. And what it did was also it signaled a more transactional and less strategic approach, I think, from Washington. So, overall, coming back to your question, I think what has changed would be the Trump administration's diminishing willingness to accommodate the domestic and historical sensitivities which shape India's foreign policy, particularly which matter to, I think, Prime Minister Modi specifically as well. Um, so I think right now the relationship lacks that mutual understanding and that diplomatic caution, which had previously allowed both sides to manage disagreements.
Yeah, you're right. I think also something that has been being that's being discussed a lot is that this downturn in relations that we're seeing, it's not just unique to this Trump era, right? It seems to be a part of a larger pattern of volatility in India-US ties. So really, I think we've largely come to question the resilience of this relationship and sort of seen how brittle it can really be. Just on a more positive note now, you've recently written on India's strategy to engage stakeholders in the US beyond the White House. So one case is the Indian caucus in the US Congress, which is one of the largest country specific caucuses. So, how critical is this role of Congress, of think tanks, of lobbyists in sort of shaping outcomes and influencing legislation around India in general?
Right. So, as I see it, of course, congressional engagement has been central when it comes to the India US relationship, which does enjoy bipartisan support in Washington. There's little doubt about that. India also benefits from having the India caucus in both the House and the Senate with bipartisan leadership, right? So now it's chaired by Ro Khanna from the Democrats and Rich McCormick from the Republican side in the Congress, right? So there's been like a lot of examples of how congressional influence has been instrumental in shaping the dynamics of India-US relationship, and of course the India-US civil nuclear deal is the most prominent example that comes to my mind, which was enabled by the strong legislative backing which supported the agreement, right? Coming to the current political landscape, of course, with Republicans controlling the House and Senate, Congress has not shown that significant pushback against Trump's evolving positions on India. But what we're seeing is that lobbying has come to take on a much more prominent role in shaping policy outcomes under Trump's second presidency, right? So I think it was very interesting, and I allude to that in my article as well, which you referred to earlier, was that India has hired Jason Miller, who was Trump's former chief spokesman and senior advisor. And to me, it's not a coincidence that, there was a shift in Trump's tone towards India, with Trump even wishing Prime Minister Modi happy birthday, So I think that coincided with Miller's visit to Trump. He posted about it on X, formerly Twitter. So, of course, I think that's not a coincidence. There definitely is some correlation there as well, even though the sequence of events does remain unclear. So, and there's also like already a lot of information which is publicly available about how personal connections and lobbying influence is especially impactful under the current administration. What was also interesting, actually, I was just reading about it actually, where Economic Times has reported that the Pakistan lobby may have influenced the revocation of India's sanction waiver when it comes to Chabahar port. So, this also shows how competitive and, consequential lobbying has become with the Trump administration right now. So I think that is specifically something we need to look at and see how that's shaping up. And meanwhile, I do think that India is engaging in this whole of government approach, right? So it's gone beyond the White House, and it's engaging with the Congress, with members of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, think tanks, and it's really going out of its way to expand its outreach beyond the executive immediately. And this, I do think, will give it the strategic depth, which may help it cushion against current volatility when it comes to the Trump administration. Because we have to remember that this is for what, 3 more years, right? So I think this whole of government approach will allow it to sort of cushion these effects and prevent long term damage. And I also have to point out that the Indian American diaspora does continue to play a critical role There are six Indian Americans in the US House of Representatives, which is the largest number in history, right? So, this growing representation does amplify India's voice in domestic US politics and also strengthens long term bipartisanal ties. So, while this is undoubtedly a very difficult time for bilateral relationships, I do think that they have strong foundations. And India's approach of engaging with multiple actors and multiple vectors will pay off.
Right. Yeah, I think I admire the positivity in your tone, Rashali. But also, there's talking about the diaspora. Since you just mentioned the enormous role that they play, we've seen a major development recently, which is US has introduced a very hefty annual fee for new visa applications, H-1B visa applications. Though it was clarified later that it applies only to new applications and not renewals or existing visa holders, but any which way, the announcement has caused so much confusion. There's been a rush among workers to return to the US before the policy's effective date. And I think this is massive, right? Because more than 70% of these visas are actually issued to Indians. So, yeah, these immigration policies are not just administrative, they have an impact on people to people ties. So,
Absolutely.
I hope this one foundation that has always been glorified, that is the Diaspora Connect that we've had, is
Mhm.
also seeing cracks, unfortunately. So coming to my next question, since we're discussing, the U.S. Congress, uh, I wanted to know your view on Sergio Gore's appointment. So he's been described as Trump whisperer and sort of more of a campaign strategist than really a diplomat. So, what message do you think does his appointment send to New Delhi? And how much agency do you think Gore really has to repair this broken trust?
Right. Thank you so much, Vanshika. That's a very interesting question. And based on how I'm seeing this, I think in New Delhi, there seems to be sort of these two broad camps which are evolving, right? So, one, they see him as this political operative with no diplomatic experience, specifically when it comes to India. Whereas the other, they talk about how his close ties to Donald Trump gives him this rare direct access to the president, right, making him a valuable asset for New Delhi, right? So again, it's true, like at just 38 he's the youngest ever ambassador, and it does sort of underscore his identity more as a campaign strategist than a traditional diplomat. However, having said that, how I see it honestly is, if you're looking at the value of this ambassador in terms of their ability to convert Indian priorities into actionable outcomes in Washington, someone with this fast senior level access can really streamline communication, reduce bureaucratic noise, and accelerate decision making, all of which is really needed to revive India US ties, right? So I think Gore's appointment does reflect that Washington is sort of giving India this high level, predictable access, and that Washington still continues to view very central to its policy making. And in fact, in his Senate hearing as well, I think Gore did allude to this, where he did say that India is central to Washington when it comes to its Indo Pacific strategy. So I think, in short, like while Gore's diplomatic inexperience could raise concerns, his political capital when it comes to Trump and sort of to act as this direct conduit to the Oval Office, it could prove valuable if it is used wisely. However, what is more concerning to me would be his role as the special envoy for South and Central Asian affairs. So again, this is the first time this has been announced. We don't know exactly what he will do in this role, what this appointment entails, but undoubtedly this does raise concern about the hyphenation of India and Pakistan, which I had alluded to earlier, and that is a framing that India has really resisted, right? So it does remain to be seen how Gore will position himself on this sensitive front. But just keeping in mind, like the Senate hearing which just took place, I am optimistic that Gore may be able to revive India-US ties and will have the agency to sort of navigate this particularly turbulent time.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, right? As you mentioned, Gore actually specifically alluded to the Indo-Pacific in his speech, which is interesting because a few days earlier, around September 9th, I think the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, he spoke to China's Minister of National Defense. And during that, very surprisingly, he actually did not mention the term Indo-Pacific. He said that the US has vital interests in Asia-Pacific,
Right.
which it sees as a priority theater. So it seemed for a while that the US was actually dumping its own creation, its own construct of the Indo Pacific, which I think was extremely alarming. But
Right.
given that we've seen Gore sort of provide some reassurance, let's talk about the Quad Summit. And we're seeing mixed signals from the Trump administration about his participation because a few weeks ago he publicly stated he'll not be attending, though right now it seems that he might be. We don't really have any clear timeline on it. Over in Japan, we're seeing this sort of leadership vacuum because Ishiba has just been sacked. So, how do you view the future of this grouping, which seems extremely sort of uncertain right now? And do you think it's just something that the Quad can afford to wait out this sort of domestic churn in its member countries?
Right. So again, let me start with saying that this isn't the first time the Quad has experienced internal churn, and it is certainly not going to be the last, right? However, I would not in any way think that this signals the collapse of the grouping because domestic political turbulence is in member countries, whether this is leadership transitions, elections, mixed signals, it is expected in any given circumstances when it comes to such forms of multilateral partnerships, right? So, individual leaders may have personal reservations, they might have domestic priorities, but ultimately, if you look at it, China's destabilizing behavior, it does continue to be the common denominator, which is driving these four countries to come closer and sort of deepen their strategic alignment, right? So, how I see it is that ultimately it doesn't matter so much whether a single president attends a summit or not, but whether the four countries remain aligned in their policy goals, in their strategic outlook. And I think so far that alignment is intact, right? And while Trump has sent sort of mixed signals about Quad participation, it's quite unexpected, honestly. Like, I mean, this chaos, which has been a trademark feature of Trump's current administration, this sort of mixed signals. I wouldn't read too much into it. But what is interesting is, again, going back to Sergio Gore's Senate confirmation hearing, he did kind of allude that Trump may be attending. He said that US remains committed to the Quad. He stressed that a stable South Asia is in America's interest. So maybe I wouldn't rule the summit out just yet. And what is also positive is that ministerial level engagements have continued, right? So I think the Quad foreign ministers met as recently as July this year. And I was really interested to see that they spoke about launching a Quad maritime legal dialogue, which would uphold maritime order in the Indo Pacific. I do want to see how that shapes up. And more broadly, I think it indicates that there's been this shift towards practical cooperation through working groups which operate at senior official levels, which do allow the Quad to continue working even though there's been sort of this turbulence and there's a hiatus at the highest leader summit level, right? So I think I wouldn't rule the Quad out, basically. And I do have to add that currently I'm in Australia, I'm in Sydney, and here I've been very interested to see how there are a lot of domestic discussions about how Canberra might push to revive and sustain this Quad momentum, especially with Prime Minister Albanese's meeting with the Trump, and there have been a lot of voices which actually advocate for Canberra to step up here and push for reviving Quad, which I think does hold a lot of potential. At the same time, it's also an opportunity for countries to strengthen their bilateral ties, which was evident with Modi visiting Japan, and it shows that even though there's some uncertainty up there, at the bilateral level, engagements do continue. But coming back to the question of Quad, I think reading the Quad through the lens of just these summit optics would probably miss the bigger picture here, which is that ultimately it is a sort of a coalition of the willing, if I can put it that way. It's not a formal structure, and that's where I think its strengths lie. So while ups and downs are natural, I think the long term trajectory still remains strategically solid. So even if the summit is delayed, or even if it doesn't take place, it should not be overinterpreted. Operational cooperation and strategic alignment do continue beneath the surface. So I have my hopes high that Quad will continue to remain relevant for both Delhi, for Washington, and even all the countries. So Tokyo and Canberra as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Rushali. I agree with you there 100%. I'm as optimistic about the Quad as you are. And what you also mentioned is important that, the summit antics shouldn't be over interpreted. But because, also as you mentioned, ultimately, these four countries are like minded partners. And whatever the turbulence right now in the India US relationship, India still broadly aligns with these nations as compared to, say, a China or a Russia. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind when we think about the Quad. The only thing that I would say has perhaps changed is that maybe India now has a sort of disproportionate responsibility to really carry the Quad forward. And I think we really need to, sort of step up in that sense, in the sense that instead of, letting America lead, I think India has the scope to sort of lead the grouping now. And of course, that was going to be my next question on, what the pulse is in Australia, where you're sitting right now. But I'm glad to know that the Australians are also as optimistic about the Quad and are as willing to make it work as India and Japan are both. As you mentioned, their bilateral visit was quite a success. So yeah, I think on that note, there was also another positive development, which was, despite all of this India US trade fallout. We actually participated in Youth Abhyas, which was held recently in Alaska. Exercise Malabar, which is not entirely under the Quad, but it has all the Quad nations participate. It's likely to be held soon, usually held around October, November in the year. So we're seeing some sort of strategic alignment on one hand, even if there is considerable economic and political sort of discord on the other. So, talking about sort of, just the military domain, there was another recent development that I thought, I could get your view on, which is the recent Saudi Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact. So, in the wake of how US has been sort of embracing Pakistan after Operation Sindoor, how do you think India should interpret this deal? What does it reveal about the credibility of the US in the region? And do you think this will have any impact on India's sort of immediate security environment?
Right. Okay. So I'll take the second part of the question first, if I got that right, which was about US credibility in the region. So I think this mutual defense pact, it reflects a broader trend, which is weakening US security guarantees, which is prompting these Gulf states to diversify their strategic partnerships, right? So these countries, which are sort of traditional US partners, they are seeking more autonomy. They are looking for more regionally balanced security arrangements rather than relying solely on Washington. And I think it's, of course, not a surprise that this comes in the immediate aftermath, just a few days after the Israeli bombings in Qatar. Doha. Yeah. So, like the attack, I think, on such a significant US partner, which hosts one of the largest American military bases in the Middle East, it is a serious escalation, right? And White House's delayed and to some extent, I think, a muted response, which fell short of a full condemnation, it has only deepened regional doubts about whether US can be considered as a reliable security guarantor. So definitely, I think there's no doubt that this is simply a reflection of growing unreliability about the US as a partner in the region. Now, when it comes to how India should view this, I think this does not directly impact South Asia's security dynamics, because even though I did come across this interview where I think it was Pakistan's foreign minister, where he said that it was to GOTV, where he said that when he was asked that does this mean Saudi Arabia will get involved in a conflict with India, and he sort of answered in the affirmative without directly mentioning India. I think that is extremely ambitious. Um, so there are differing motivations when it comes to why the Saudis entered into the pact and why Pakistan did. But I think in no way does it signify that they will get involved in Pakistan's historic disputes. But is it a cause of concern for New Delhi? Yes, because I think it does complicate our diplomacy in West Asia. India has to now navigate a much more fragmented security landscape in the Gulf, especially as its ties with the Arab world and Israel is deepening, right? So, what it also does is this pact specifically does signal that Pakistan is leveraging these new alignments to boost its strategic relevance. And India will definitely monitor this closely. But again, coming back, I don't think it is going to shift or impact the military balance in South Asia. What it will probably do is force India to look closer at its West Asian diplomacy. So far, we've been noticing that there's been this tilt towards Israel vis-a-vis Palestine. After decades of India championing the Palestinian cause. And this is something that India has been able to navigate without complicating its relations with the Arab world, but now that is changing. Because as I see it, these countries are becoming much more united around a more hardline stance towards Tel Aviv, right? So India may need to recalibrate its position. And I think this is underway already, especially with India's recent voting patterns in the United Nations, and as well as using fairly harsh language when it comes to condemning the strikes, Israel's recent strikes. I think those are indications that there might be a shift underway. But I don't think this is something that India will have to worry about when it comes to the military balance of South Asia.
Right. Yeah, I think that gives a lot of clarity on the situation. Well, thank you so much, Rushali. You've given a great overview of the India-US relationship, the future of the Quad, which we hope continues to develop and grow massively, and also the nervousness and sort of anxiety about the world order in general. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Vanshika.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.